I can't wait until we actually get into our board meeting room.
That seems
I'm
like
with
a
you.
long time ago.
Okay, all set.
Thank you, Barb.
Yep.
All right. I would like to call to order the June 15th meeting of the MMSD Operations Work Group. Our first item of business is approval of minutes. I move to approve the minutes from the Operations Work Group meeting dated May 11th, 2020. Can we get a second?
Second.
Thanks. Thank you. I think I heard Ollie, so Ollie seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 All right, motion passes 7-0. Thanks, everybody, and welcome to this meeting. I want to give just a really quick overview of what we're going to be doing tonight. We actually have a lot of ground to cover tonight, particularly in terms of the budget. I'm going to try to be an organized facilitator and move us through this efficiently, but also with lots of time for everybody to voice concerns, questions, anything you need to know about the budget before we move into our vote on June 29th. We're going to begin with an update on Referenda 2020. We're then going to move into the meat of our meeting, which is the budget discussion, where we will need to make a couple of key decisions about how Kelly should move forward with revising the draft preliminary budget that we'll be voting on in a couple weeks. And then finally, we're going to look at a proposed change to policy 6071, which is the fund balance policy. Great, so for the referendum discussion, which Kelly and Chad will be giving us an update, I'm going to encourage everybody to jot down your questions and hold them until the end of the presentation. For this one, we're not going to have a pause point midway through the slides. The main feedback that Kelly and Chad are looking for and that we need as a board as well is, first of all, if you have had an opportunity to reach out to your networks or to the community and talk about the referendum, we would like to know what you're hearing. And secondly, we need to know what additional data or information you need to be able to vote at some point in July on whether or not we should go to referendum. So be thinking about what additional information you need, as well as any community information you have to share. And on that note, I will turn things over to Kelly and Chad. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I can get things started here. Kelly and I will kind of tag team back and forth. And like Chris said, we're going to try to go through a decent amount of content here in a relatively short period of time. We know everyone's got a busy night with the budget discussion. Objectives for our meeting tonight will be to review where we're at and revisit the why, and confirm if we are still on track for a potential November 2020 referenda. Confirming any community feedback or potential questions that the board's been hearing over the last couple months. Respond to any of the remaining board questions that you guys might have tonight, and then discussion and next steps. Kelly, I can take this one, and then why don't you bounce to the next one. So as a reminder, and you guys have seen this a number of times, we've made it now to the middle of this adjusted timeline. COVID-19 threw a little bit of a wrench into our plans, and we've adjusted accordingly. We are sitting kind of firmly in the middle of that February to July timeline, and we are hoping that the board starts to reach some consensus around whether or not there will be a vote for those two questions and when that vote might be. As a reminder, once we get a vote, that actually gives us a little bit of time to continue to make sure our public's as informed as possible. We're hoping that August through October window, and then we hit a November of 2020 ballot if everything comes together.
So we thought we would start tonight by just kind of revisiting the why. And the why not just behind the potential operating referendum, but also the why behind the facilities referendum. So there's a primary kind of root cause as to why we started the referendum discussions well over a year ago now, as it relates to the facilities, and about a year ago for the operating referendum. And that primarily is because of the lack of stability in public education funding over the last 10 years. This graph, this picture can tell 1,000 words. Ultimately, the instability of public education funding has made it very difficult to provide for long-term planning and long-term funding as it relates to our operational budget, and particularly as it relates to facilities. As public school districts have to fund buildings and facilities kind of through their operating budget, over the last 10 years, it's constantly put us in a position of having to choose between investing in our facilities and investing in the academic structure of our students and our support of our staff, which is just a very difficult place to be. And then we enter into a COVID environment where we continue to add more unknowns and instability for our future. So when you saw this slide back in the fall, at that point, we thought we would be receiving about $7.8 million in new funding for 2021. That funding is now up for question as to if we'll receive it at all, which means the projected budget gaps that we thought we would have over the next 4 years, which was about $30 million, that we thought even then that we would have, has now increased to near $40 million in potential budget gaps for the next 4 years. So knowing kind of what's on our horizon, our referendum discussion tonight certainly centers around the need of supporting all of our students and our staff moving the school district forward. But it also is grounded in the fact that public education is kind of facing a reflecting point right now. We know that the future is not likely to look similar to what education looks like today. And in order to ensure that we can provide a positive environment for the shifts for the future, we really need to make sure that the resources are available as well. Back in the fall, we took your draft plan out to the community. As a reminder, we talked to over 4,300 community members, over 100 students as part of the fall information feedback session, and Chad talked to many more students as part of the overall facilities work as well. And what they told us back then was that we heard we had broad support for a possible referenda at the proposed cost back in the fall, but we also heard some concern over the total cost. You all met in March to reevaluate that ask and did decrease that ask. So we'll revisit that in this presentation to make sure everyone's on the same page since so much time has passed. As part of the feedback, we heard that one of the key aspects that our community is expecting out of this referendum is to address inequities that are built into the system and to put those first and foremost into our spending plans. The community also asked for not only MMSD, but the Board of Education in particular, to individually reach out to the community and continue to keep the community updated on the referendum progress. So we aim to do all that as we kind of continue to bring back the whys behind the referendum. Another why that's worth bringing up today as a reminder is that while in the short term, our economic environment might be changing around us, what we know is we still anticipate receiving 1,600 students in the next 18 years. Our long-range facility plan that's posted on the website is meant to be the first step in making sure our facilities are prepared for the future. Our academics can change with our facilities and it will have a place for these students to go. The high school plans are built on that potential capacity growth so that we're prepared when they're there, when these students arrive. And so Chad's going to talk about the capital referendum.
Thanks, Kelly. So I've got just you guys have seen these slides a number of times, but just a reminder to make sure that we are all on the same page and if we've got questions. So as a reminder on the capital side, we're proposing a $317 million capital referendum investing in the following: significant renovations in our 4 high schools that will impact 1/3 of our students. And we've been busy with the Findorf team and the design teams over the last few months. That work has not stopped. In fact, it's accelerated in terms of making sure we had cost estimates correct. I just had meetings with principals, assistant principals, and ADs over the last few days to update them on progress we've made there. An investment in our Capital High School students, moving them out of less than ideal situations at both Lapham Elementary and across the street from Memorial into the Hoyt Building, and the potential of a new elementary school in the south of Madison to alleviate both transportation issues and a long-standing lease with Monona Schools that we want to get out of. As a reminder, and Kelly's continued to crunch these numbers, and they'll get more and more exact as we get closer and closer to actually knowing when Kelly has to borrow money. We are estimating about a $50 year an increase in taxes per $100,000 in home value for about $140 per year on the average household. And that would be debt that eventually goes away the same way I believe Olson Elementary School falls off the books here in the next couple of years. And lastly, for me, just kind of an update on what we've been up to. So as I mentioned, we've been very hard at work with the Findorf team. I can't say enough about bringing them kind of onto our side and onto our team to make sure that what we had continued to design and build with these school communities was doable. It was very important to me that we didn't get to the ballot in November, design these projects, send them out to bid, and find out they were 10 or 15% over budget. And then we have lots of really difficult decisions to make, disappointed end users and full school board in baskets, and we didn't want that. So we've continued to make sure that those projects are on budget, and we feel very good about where they're at. In fact, we've had to trim a few things that have nothing substantial, but Findorf's made us answer some questions along the way, which has been really good. As a reminder, with your feedback and pushing after we heard from the community, we did include an additional $2 million in environmental work that will happen at our high schools. And that will include expanded solar and PV arrays, ultra efficient lighting throughout. This list isn't certainly as comprehensive as could be. A reminder that we're really interested in authentic learning experiences that actually integrate the construction projects into our classroom settings. There'll be numerous aspects of green space and water retention that are also included. And just a reminder, this was talking points at the last presentation that Kelly and I went through, but I thought it was worthy of us putting in writing. We do really feel that the K-12 construction environment is trending towards favorable on our behalf, the buyer's behalf. So there will be a number of large K-12 construction projects that will wrap up by the time we put the first shovel in the ground. That is beneficial to us because we like a competitive bidding environment where folks in the community are hungry for work. We've heard, and I think we've certainly seen this, that if there's a slowdown in the economy, typically construction may lag a year or two behind. The instant COVID-19 hit, you didn't see the cranes in downtown Madison disappear. But that will happen if there's a downturn in the economy. And that would be another way we'd get more competitive pricing if people are hungry for work. And I should say, the piece around being hungry for work, we feel like that's actually a win-win. We will be employing thousands of people in Dane County when we put these projects, when we start to build these projects, which I think is a huge benefit. There's low petroleum costs that also typically trends towards cheaper construction, and we'll actually be able to leverage historically low interest rates that we will be paying off for 20 years, and we'll be locked in at a rate, and it doesn't matter what happens to that rate down the road. We'll be locked into it. So a really favorable environment for us to be bidding post-November.
And so a last final reminder is what we did back in March to respond to the community feedback is we restructured the overall finance plan for this facilities work, spreading out the costs more over time to reduce the impact of the 2021 and 21-22 ask. Overall, which reduced the ask of the average home buyer by $240 for the first 4 years. So just wanted to make sure that or kind of reminder that work was done. As we move into the operating referendum side of the house, Reminder on our conversations back in March. We had a question out to the community in the fall regarding a cumulative $36 million. You would remember that was an 8-8-10-10 model, meaning we asked for $8 million for 2021, $8 million for 2022, $10 million for and $10 million for the last 2 years. Instead, we came out of the March meeting dropping the ask based on the community feedback to a 6-8-9-10 model. Ultimately, what this looks like is an $82 per year incremental increase for the average homeowner over the next 4 years. After 4 years, then it no longer grows, but it does stay in the base revenue in the future. Through the course of our referendum conversations, the board has set forth a number of priorities, including new reading materials in line with a structured approach to phonics. A full day 4K is definitely on the radar, along with supporting at-risk youth, world language, art, music, science, and of course, attracting, retaining high quality teachers and student supports. These all remain extremely important and high priorities for the operating budget. And in light of kind of the new world we are facing in education, it'll be incredibly important that these priorities, along with new priorities that we may not even know yet in the new education horizon, kind of are available to us, and the operating referendum would potentially give you kind of that flexibility to move with the future. When we stack the operating and facilities referendum together, we do need to pay attention to that as we think about the overall environment of the economy today. You are looking at a 4-year, year by year 4, an impact on the average homeowner of $480. Now, it would not grow. That would be kind of the maximum that it stays at that point in time. But it always is important to keep in mind as we continue to have our referendum discussions. As we know, there's a lot going on in the community. We do know that like some data is coming in around the economic impact. And so as we get it, it's important to keep in mind. We have seen unemployment rates go up in Madison, of course, as it has around the rest of the state. But it is maybe positive light that Madison has the lowest unemployment rate right now in the entire state. So while it has gone up, the good news is it's looking like Madison is potentially weathering the storm better than some of our surrounding communities. And we're also seeing the medical industry start to come back. And some of the furloughs in the medical industry starting to come back will also help Madison in the upcoming months. So we know we'll need to continue to pay attention to all those economic statistics, and we will, but want to keep all that on the horizon too as you have those conversations. So overall, the cumulative reduction of the decisions you made back in March was to reduce the overall operating and facilities ask on the average homeowner by $312. So that is kind of just our summary to remind everybody of where we are, where we've come from, and hopefully where we're going to. As I hand this over to Chris to facilitate kind of the rest of the discussion process. After this, we just have one slide to wrap it up.
Thank you, Chad and Kelly, for that in-depth and helpful discussion or presentation. I just want to open it up to questions at this point. Does anybody have any clarifying questions before we move into a more structured discussion? And I can't see everybody, so you might need to speak up.
Amanda.
Go ahead, Ananda, thanks.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you so much for this presentation. It was really helpful. Chad, I'm just wondering if there have been any conversation with your team about possibilities to restructure the building inside or external features due to this new era that we're experiencing with physical distancing and whatnot, and if you are foreseeing at this point budget implications.
Yeah, so Ananda, there would certainly, good question. There would certainly be budget implications if we started taking down walls and opening up spaces that we had not yet kind of planned for in our original first blush at a master plan. We do have nearly $1 million set aside at each site for the purchase of classroom furniture and some of the other kind of extra costs that will go into these projects that will be decided, well after the buildings are actually being designed. We could take that into consideration, but we're certainly finding, especially with Findorf, they've been so good with us in terms of cost estimating, that we're starting to get to the level of detail that we had a meeting with Memorial today, that they were wondering around just moving a classroom here that might now need a bathroom, that there's give and take that we've estimated this room, is getting $180 a square foot. And if we want to make that a room that's going to cost $350 a square foot, something has to give at other spots in the project. So, I can tell you that, almost to a project, we are opening up some spaces that will allow for more flexibility. We're filling in a courtyard at Memorial that will be 8,000 square feet of collaboration space that will have flexible furniture in it, and we'll be able to curtail that space to exactly how they want it. We're actually looking at repurposing the old middle school gym at West High School. And right now we have money set aside to refurbish that space, but we've yet to decide even where the walls might go, or if that is a wall-less gym that is adaptable in terms of our need to social distance. So I feel like there's some places that there are some flexibility for design, but I'd be lying to you if I said that for us to do more of a gut job on the inside of the building and stay on budget would be really difficult to do. It would take more money into what we're doing to start from scratch in terms of some of the classroom spaces. A typical many of our typical instructional settings, like a classroom at West High School that hasn't been touched in 50 or 60 years, will get new ceilings, new lights, new floors, and new furniture, but there isn't money in the budget to tear down walls and make temporary partitions for allowing future flexibility. The part of where the reality of where we're at, and the board knows this, is that we are addressing long-standing maintenance issues that have been ignored for a while, and some of the costs that are going into these projects are just taking care of some of the things we've neglected.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, Chris,
Okay,
I'd like
I
to,
would like, oh, Ollie.
thank you. So Chad and Kelly, I'd like to thank you all for your work. I'm curious about cost savings related to projects we're doing in the interest of sustainability. So what does our current investment mean for our ability to have a more conservative approach to energy and also promote sustainability within our schools, and also any cost savings related to the facilities referenda?
I can maybe take the first part of that, and then Kelly, maybe you want to wrap up kind of what you do with it on an annual basis. So Ali, some of the things we are investing in, we'll see a payback, like the solar panels, we'll see a payback in 7 to 10 years, where we may invest in $200,000 or $250,000 in a solar array on top of a high school, and we'll offset that energy cost in a matter of 7 to 10 years. That's what we're projecting at the solar array we're actually putting on West High School. So there's an initial upfront cost, but then we should see energy bills go down in accordance that Kelly can now kind of bake into the annual budget. If we've got too much money set aside for what we're paying in electricity, Kelly can make adjustments and push that money in other places. Some of the other things we have built into these projects, things like windows and lights, have in some cases a little longer return on investment, but certainly will still be there, and those will be times that we'd actually see savings in gas. I guess it should be noted that, like in particular, like in the case of La Follette, where we're recommending almost wall-to-wall air conditioning, so we can continue to have summer school. In the event the board at some point wanted to go year-round school, you guys wanted to go, 45 days on and 15 days off, we're ready to go. And these schools are heavily used by the community. We feel good about the air conditioning, but that also comes at a cost. We're not paying the electric bill on air conditioning at La Follette High School right now. because only 10% of the thing's air conditioned. So there's a little bit of give and take there. So I guess my piece would be, we build these things as efficiently as possible. And then it would be up to the board, along with how Kelly started to move some things in the budget, to make a determination of when we saw savings on those utilities, where that money went. If it went back into further green investments, that I build other projects that are green, if it went into my budget to try to maintain other sites, or if it's needed in other places, and Kelly works with the board to determine where that funding stream goes. Kelly, I don't know if you had anything else to really add to that.
Oh, I think Chad answered it great.
You absolutely did. Thank you so much for speaking to my question, Chad, and thank you for your work, Kelly.
Yeah.
And Chad.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, Chris, it's Chris. I have a couple of questions. I'm just curious with the, when do we receive the results of the poll, the community poll that I believe we're taking? Is that still happening? And when might we have that information? And then are we also getting some guidance on some more like specific questions and community groups to reach out to as we continue to take into consideration that the community wanted to continue the discussion with us over this?
So the planning efforts around the poll are ongoing, and hoping to have like results available for you towards the beginning to middle of July. That was your first question. As far as the second question around community input, I'm hoping we can get to the questions on the slide because I intended to use the results of that conversation to build out the next steps, which can and could include like specific maybe assignments for board members to help reach out to the community, of course, with talking points and whatnot. But I do think the next stage of work is probably some direct outreach from board members, but we can make those decisions based on the conversation coming up.
Okay. I guess I'll just share that what I've been hearing from people is that there's a recognition of the, real student needs that continue to grow in our district, but also that there's a responsibility to the taxpayer and with whatever decision we may make in that. So it doesn't feel like it's changed a whole lot from where we were a month ago. It's, I think people are recognizing, the real and growing needs that we have. But concern, about raising taxes in the time that we're in right now.
Sabian here. I guess what I've been hearing from my network is that the referendum is still necessary, especially for the equity projects that we want to proceed with. One area of concern I'm still hearing from people is what kind of elementary school will be going on the south side. And so hopefully by a vote or by the time we get to a vote, we have a process drawn out for how we'll determine that elementary school.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you.
Chris, can I add one more thing? I think people are also questioning not knowing where the state budget is going to fall and the uncertainty with that. That's been another thing up in the air, and I know we're going to discuss that later, but people are concerned about what that's going to mean for the funding for our schools.
I think, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay, can I go? We're on to answering these questions, right? Okay. So I think, I'm getting a mixed bag. I mean, I think mixed, I think the need, if people do express the need to do this, but I think my network right now that, are very blue collar, just working people who have lost their jobs or trying to transition back into their jobs. And, this is really, the conversation is a shock factor, like you guys are still gonna do this. And, so I think families are really just balancing, the importance of this and the definitely understanding the need, but also the financial component is really hard during current times. And so I think definitely understanding the importance, but still struggling, right? And so that's the reality. And I think people are feeling that, yes, if things are better, right, back to work, I definitely commit. This is something that I find very important. So just from what I'm getting right now from my network of people.
Thanks, Gloria. Do you need any other data or information prior to making a decision?
Who are you asking this, Chris? Are you asking this to us?
I was asking Gloria
Oh, I'm
specifically, but we'll go around and make sure everybody gets a chance to give feedback on
Oh,
that.
okay.
I think I don't think I need any further data. I think what I'm looking forward to doing is expanding my network, right? I mean, and seeing and hearing other perspectives. But other than that, I think the poll is going to be, something that I will be looking at, and is the data that I would want to have to make a final decision, and then expanding my network, but nothing else.
Yeah, Kelly, if I could follow up on that, I think it'd be worthwhile. I know that before COVID hit, we did some really intentional outreach to groups, and that work kind of got upended. I think it would be beneficial if we restart that by interest groups or by groups and by region of the city or by attendance zones. I think could be helpful, but yeah, I know that our outreach was kind of upended by the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for the next phase of work, we're really thinking, Savion, that this is going to be board member outreach, and how the board members kind of want to divide and conquer is something I'll work with kind of Gloria or Chris on. But we definitely agree that some more outreach. It'll probably be by virtual means or phone calls, considering the current environment, but is a good next step.
Nikki, we haven't heard from you. I'm wondering if you could speak to anything you've heard from the community, as well as any additional data you might need to be able to make a decision or information.
I don't need any more data other than the poll that we already have. As for the disability community, of course, their financial worries. The main thing I'm hearing is accessibility, accessibility, accessibility. That's the main thing I'm hearing. It's not disagreement. It's just, please don't forget us. That's exactly what I've been told multiple times.
Thanks for that, Nikki. Let's see, Ananda, do you have anything to add in terms of additional information you might need before we vote?
No, I don't think I need a particular information. What I am curious about, which is the question I asked earlier to Chad, is in regards to all the other schools that were also not in in good shape, and having to make some adaptations to have students coming back. So I know I'm not a healthcare, I don't have any background in healthcare, but what I know from what I read from other countries and what I'm expecting is going to happen in this country is that this is not something that's going to end in 2021, that we're going to continue, this culture shift of needing greater levels of space in classrooms, fiberglass partition between different things and sinks and things like that. And I'm just really curious about how asking the lower end of our original ask is going to reflect in the upcoming years. given that we're, this is a multi-year situation that we are experiencing. So I don't know exactly how, I guess I am asking a question, but I don't know exactly what I need other than just that is a concern. And if part of that money it's going to be used to address that we should elevate that as well. Because I think it is important for our community to know that adjustments will need to be made. And I'm thinking in particular our elementary schools, and we have elementary schools that are at capacity. What would having even smaller classrooms or different ways to separate classrooms that keep less students at any given time. So those are the things that are concerning to me, and the budget implication of those things. I really appreciate, Chris, you doing another round. Thank you.
Ananda, I really appreciate your comment about wanting to make sure that we're budgeting for COVID in the coming school year. And I assume your comment about reducing the ask was about the operating referendum. Is that correct? That we knocked that down to 6 million? Or were you talking about the facilities? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yes, correct.
So are you saying that we might actually want to think about making sure that we can actually pay our COVID expenses with that amount before we move forward for a vote? Is that the information you're looking for?
Right, so there's two parts, right? So there is, on the building renovation, what is the implication for things that are unexpected that now we have to plan around? I know each school is different. So do we have to create structures at the high school level that gives a greater distance, for example, in a welcome center? Do we even the purchase of more, liquid gels, and liquid gel stations or cleaning stations, like those are added costs if we think about equipping all our schools with those things. And those are some of the things that are coming to mind as I'm seeing, as I'm navigating different business, right? Like places where hallways are just one way because it's really narrow, greater levels of signage so people are, organized in the way that they're walking. So there is a part of Chris that is about the building. And yes, and there is a part that there is the operations and how that plays around. Thank you for the clarifying question.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that.
Chris, would you mind if I just try to address that with Ananda one more time, hopefully get a little more clarification?
Yeah, go for
Ananda,
it.
I hear you loud and clear. At the elementary level, where we haven't really budgeted anything other than building a new elementary school from scratch, we're going to have to do the very best we can to make the schools as safe as possible in the fall if we decide to bring students back. So we've got teams working on that right now, and it will be one-way hallways likely. It will be plexiglass barriers where you didn't see them before. It will likely be classrooms outfitted with cleaning supplies and hand sanitizer right to a teacher. And we're going to have to do the best we can with the kind of the budget constraints we have. With the high school projects, many of the things you just mentioned actually are built into the projects. Doubling the size of the ceiling at La Follette High School so students aren't elbow to elbow when there's passing time. Every one of the high school projects will actually get a new welcome center that will allow us to design and rebuild those spaces from scratch. The nursing areas will be redone at every single high school. So right now, many of the nursing stations are much smaller than they need to be, especially even as we bring folks back into the fall. So you have my word, we're going to take those into design considerations at the high school, and that we're going to do our very best with the budget we have to make sure that the buildings are as safe as they can be if and when students return in the fall. And then understand that we also think that this is probably not the last facilities ask in the future. We'll likely need to build a new elementary school on the far west side of Madison sometime in the next 4, 5, 6 years. And we know we have lots of other sites that also need to be addressed as well. And The times are certainly changing, and we would continue to make sure we adapt with the design work we did if we went to referendum in the future for other sites. Kelly, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to add two things, particularly as it relates to the operating side of the questions. One, I think it's important to remember, we talked about this a lot in the beginning, but it's probably worth bringing it back. That is, when the high schools become more efficient, when they don't need a large majority of Chad's budget anymore, that will free up a good percentage of Chad's budget for the middle and elementary school needs. Right now, those buildings are sucking up a large percentage of the facilities and maintenance budget. So getting the high schools done will free up other money to get more projects done. So one, and two, I just want to remind you that when we were back in March, I had put a $4 million offer kind of for the 2021 year option on the table, and the board went with $6 million. Now, we don't know where the state budget repair bill is, and we may not know by July or August 17th even. So the board's going to have to be willing to move forward with some uncertainty around the state level budget. But there's at least $2 million in that 6, 8, 9, 10 model that is more flexible, let's just say, for the board to decide how you want to spend it, all depending on how that state budget repair bill is. We'll help you decide whether there's real flexibility for anything new. But it's not like we went with the $4 million for 2021. So I just want to make sure that kind of as a reminder that is a little bit more.
Thank you, Kelly, for that reminder. And thank you, Chad, for giving me some really specifics. I think one of the things that haven't been part of the conversation is, and mostly because we haven't really seen what the hybrid version look like. But if we're continue to be this hybrid version, which means that a lot of our staff will continue to work at least part-time from home, what supports the staff are going to need in regards to stipends or other resources, to both making sure that the internet is something that can accommodate to working at home adults, a chair, ergonomic chair at home, things that we hadn't necessarily thought about before. And I know that I'm thinking that we're thinking about that, IDPI, like what is the, like if we're gonna stay working from home, what is the long-term strategy and the budget implication for staying at least part-time at home for a longer period of time. But I'll leave this question for when we talk more about the hybrid. But thank you so much, Chris, for that time.
Yeah, and Ananda, I will point out that there is time in the budget discussion for COVID expenditures, and a lot of what you were just saying, I think, flows into that part of our conversation tonight really nicely. So thanks for that little bridge there. Chris, did you have anything to add?
No, I think I got my questions answered and look forward to the information that we already talked about. I think that'll help me get up to speed, given that I'm coming in on the very tail end of these discussions. Thank you.
Thanks. Ollie, did you have anything to add?
Thank you so much, Chris, for going back over these questions. So from my immediate network, especially folks who are alumni of Madison Metropolitan School District, I'm hearing a lot of excitement and a lot of interest in the potential for change. Me and Gloria both went to East. We have Milt McPike in common. What we also have in common is the heating system at East, which is still there. And it's not particularly sexy, but we're investing in the basic infrastructure of our schools to a greater extent. And that's something I can't emphasize enough. I think a lot of the questions that I have at this point are really similar to Ananda's in terms of they're not questions our immediate team can answer. How the budget repair bill turns out is going to have a major impact. Whether or not the federal government is going to give funding to school districts in order to combat COVID-19 is something I remain hopeful about. I think Kelly and Chad have done a really fantastic job of preparing us for this decision. And I think it's clear that this is the right thing to do and is a worthwhile investment in education, in public education locally. So I am excited for us to move forward. And I think there's a great deal of hope and potential attached to these projects.
Thanks, Ollie. I will just close out the comments by
Sure.
saying that, oh, Sabian, did you have anything to add?
Sorry, yeah, one more thing. In recent discussions, especially over the past 2 weeks or so, 3 weeks, is specifically how this referendum, particularly the operating monies, will be used to help out, to help Black students in education. And I think it's something that we'll all need to be able to speak to, whether it's talking about more behavioral health specialists in schools or all-day 4K. And how maintaining class sizes helps our Black students. And so being able to speak specifically to that is something I think the community will want us to do.
Thank you for that, Sabian. Yeah, my comments would be, I've heard pretty consistent community support for going to referenda. I think despite the financial challenges of the current time, at least within my networks, there's still a great deal of support for public education and wanting to make sure that Madison continues to have good schools, and the recognition that our high school buildings, they need to be maintained, and that given the uncertainty of the state budget and the uncertainty of the federal government actually plugging in enough money to cover the costs of COVID, we need to fund our schools. So one piece of data that I would like to get would be, Kelly, you talked about the fact that you guys have some economic impact data, particularly unemployment data for Madison. I would actually like to see that data if possible. I think that would be helpful just in thinking about where we're headed with this. Also, if you have any data about unemployment trends, or if there's anyone's doing projections of that, that would be really helpful as well.
Yeah, Chris, I'm just pulling from local newspaper results, but I can find those articles back and resend it to you. They've been published in the last couple of weeks.
Okay. Is Andrew looking at this at all? Or his team?
Andrew, are you on? Would you like to jump in?
I think he's on, but yes, I'm sure it's on your radar screen too.
Okay, yeah, anything we can get about how this might impact not just the city of Madison, but our attendance area would help with decision making. So
there he is.
Good evening. Hi. We certainly can look at various government data sources, including unemployment claims, and they tend to lag. So the last time I looked, we were so new into the COVID environment that it wasn't illustrating anything. It was most of February and part of March, but we'll take a fresh look at it. And as Kelly indicated as well, there are lots of news stories out there, so we can take a sweep and get the boards for sure.
Thank you. That'd be really helpful. Thanks. And then a second thing that is on my mind is that before everything shut down, we were talking about creative ways to get input from the South Side about a new South Side school, which included things like going door to door, which obviously we can't do. So I'm giving some thought to making sure that grassroots voice from the South Side is captured before we go ahead and make that decision about which school we're going to put on the South Side. I think is something we still need to focus on. And that kind of builds off what Sabian said earlier. That is all I have to say. So thank you, Kelly and Chad, for this update. Do you feel like you have the information you need to move forward over the next couple weeks?
Yeah, I think the only thing maybe I want to make sure everyone remembers is that even if the board has to kind of vote to put questions on a ballot ahead of a state budget repair bill, that you always have the right, ability, authority to underlevy. So if we end up in a situation where you have a question on the ballot and the state comes in with a better budget than we may have anticipated, or we get more funding from the feds in those hopeful scenarios, the board can always, at the end of October, when you vote on the budget, underlevy. And that would be, a week ahead of the referendum question itself, but certainly enough time to inform the community that you planned on underlevying ahead of the vote. So just remember that that's out there. So the timeline, as that links in, is right in front of you. We are looking for the board to kind of schedule the vote at some point coming up soon here. So keep us posted as you're thinking through that and getting your community feedback. Know that we are preparing a communication toolkit for you. When you do schedule that vote, we'll have it, make sure it's ready for you to be on the other side, to get the public information out there. So that's underway. The other work that's underway is trying to figure out kind of what public information sharing looks like in light of COVID. And so to the earlier comments, I am hearing some kind of support for kind of public outreach in the upcoming weeks for each of you individually in your network or out of your network. So I'll work with Chris and Gloria in the next couple days around what that immediate step looks like, but know that the communication plans for the longer term strategy through October are also underway in light of not being able to do some of the traditional ways that we might work in the fall. Our communications team, as already evidenced, is absolutely incredible and has all the best and brightest minds thinking about this and preparing for it for us. So just know that that's work underway.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks again, Chad. And I
Thank
think
you,
we can
guys.
move on now to the budget discussion. So I want to just frame this by saying that in many, many years of watching MMSD make budgets, both on and off the board, this is by far the most challenging budget year I've witnessed. We need to go into this discussion knowing that we have to pass a balanced budget, and we are working with highly imperfect information, and we're going to have to make a lot of assumptions that may end up not being right. But we're going to have to just make the best assumptions we possibly can. So please kind of keep that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about the decision points that we need to address in tonight's conversation. And the two key decisions we have to make are, first of all, we have to come up with some new assumptions about revenue. And this is where these assumptions are going to be imperfect because we don't have good information. The state has not told us if we're going to have a budget repair bill or how much that budget repair bill might be for and what kind of impact it might have on public schools. But we have to make some assumptions about revenue that put us in a position that we can roll with what happens. Additionally, we need to make plans for expenditures that align with our revenue assumptions because we have to balance the budget. So whatever decisions we make about our income assumptions, our revenue assumptions have to be matched with some decisions about spending. And please keep in mind that this year, more than most years, this is a draft budget. This is not set in stone. Hopefully, as we get more information from the state, we can make revisions going into the final October vote that reflect better information. So right now, I would like us to think about like we're not cutting the budget as much as we're pausing pieces of the budget if we decide that's necessary to align both what we think is a safe assumption for revenue and what we think is a good, good things to pause to help us balance at this point in time with bad information. Hang on just a second, Nikki. I will call on you before we start. This is also our last opportunity to answer questions and talk about the budget before we vote on a draft preliminary budget in June. So please take advantage of that opportunity. Please leave tonight knowing that you have to the best of your ability, like put all your questions on the table and gotten them answered. Kelly is, in addition to putting forth these two important decisions we have to make, she's going to give us an update on what's going on with COVID aid and expenses. We're going to get a little update on what's going on with Title I funding. And we're also going to get an update on what's going on with our food service revenues, Fund 50, which is a whole different thing because it's a self-sustaining program. We're going to have two pauses in Kelly's presentation. We're going to pause once after the revenue assumptions, just to clarify. We're not going to make any decisions at that point, but it'll just be a moment to ask clarifying questions. Likewise, we will pause again after Kelly presents the options for expenditure pausing. Again, just for clarifying questions, not to make a decision at that point. And then afterwards, we'll have open questions about everything, and then we will go back and discuss those two decision points. I think we'll have a better discussion if we've heard the whole presentation first. Nikki, now that I've said all that, do you still have a question?
Yes, the statement actually, quick statement. I respect the sport. I respect MMSD, but until MMSD works out the employee handbook decision, I cannot participate in budget discussions. I will watch, I will just not comment, and I cannot vote for any budget draft or final that does not have MTI's at least a meeting with in good faith on the situation, especially since possible litigation now is involved with the formal complaint. And I thank you for your understanding.
All right. Kelly, do you want to go to the PowerPoint?
Can I just say a few things, Chris? I know that Kelly's muted here.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I just want to say, just a few thoughts to share as we continue our talks about the budget. The COVID-19 crisis has really brought to light how important our public schools are and how much of a core of our fabric of the community they are. And really, we've seen this crisis bring out the best in our community and collaborative efforts to actually serve our students and families. We've seen neighbors helping neighbors. We've watched as our educators transform the way they teach and connect with families and students. Organizations and businesses throughout Madison have really formed innovative partnerships with us to address problems that we have gotten through together. And as has been noted tonight, our district has remained a significant part of Madison's economic engine. Our community is stronger when we work together as we have during the last months, and yet we still face unprecedented needs. And as we've talked about tonight, our kids need more, not less. Yet unfortunately, we face this harsh budget reality. And as Chris has said, we are going to need to make some really tough decisions as we face maybe a $7 to $9 million budget reduction. So just want to remind us that, we've been working together to solve these problems. We still need to do that. We have some tough decisions to make, but it'll be necessary for us to work together, our communities and our partnerships to work with us as well. And, in the past, we've always taken the budget feedback process very seriously. And Kelly will talk about this more, but the main takeaway for us is to really follow our core values on this. We keep students at the center. We protect their relationships. We protect the programming that we have for them. We put equity first. And hiring and retaining diverse staff members must remain a high priority for us. So I want to thank you all for your partnership working through this together. And on behalf of our 27,000 students, I thank you for them as well. So just wanted to say those few comments tonight as you head into this additional discussion about the budget. Thank you, Chris, for the time. Kelly?
Thank you, Jane. I appreciate your pointing out that sometimes challenging times bring out the best in people.
That's right.
Well said, Jane.
All right, thank you, Jane. That was a great transition and greatly appreciated. So our objectives for tonight, as it always is in June, and our June operation work group, is to prepare for the June budget vote, which you will be asked to vote on at the end of the month. June always requires reflecting on what we heard from the community, making shifts where we need to in our assumptions and our expenditure plans, and to finalize any open questions that you might have in order to prepare for your vote at the end of the month. As already mentioned, unfortunately, the next phase of our budget work, which will start on July 1, will look a bit different this year. There are more unknowns, and more decisions that'll need to be made over the summer and going into October than we're typically used to. We're used to voting on the June budget and then putting it on the shelf until we get more information from the state in October. Probably won't be able to do that this year. We'll vote on this June budget, which will allow us to operate. As Chris has already said, the June budget's a really draft budget that just allows us to keep the system running. You'll have other opportunities to weigh in on the budget when we know more about the revenue strategy, and then the October budget would ultimately be your final budget. So thank you for Chris and Jane for kind of layering that all in. And I want to thank you all for your grace and flexibility during these uncertain times. Very grateful kind of for all of you. And I just want to make sure that's put out there too, that your hard work is not unnoticed. So we start every budget process with our educational equity policy. It's more important than ever for us to pause, really look at the policy and make sure we're internalizing it. When resources become scarce, the conversations become more difficult. And it's important that our equity lens goes first. In line with that, we have a strategic framework. 3,000 people weighed in on that strategic framework. Not only the goals that you have in front of you now and the core values, but also the priorities of the community are laid out in the strategic framework. It might be a good time to look back at the framework and reread it and make sure that we're leading with the community's kind of core values first. As we look at our timeline in front of us, as already mentioned, we'll go through some of the community input today and get ready for the board vote. But in July, August, and September, we're likely going to need to be revisiting all this again, potentially rebalancing where needed, and definitely by October. We'll have to look closely at our enrollment counts this year. Being in such an unknown environment, we will have to pay attention to those numbers. Our general aid, equalization aid from the state could change along with the revenue. So all these things will be important to remain in contact and be ready for new decisions if they're needed, even after June. So this is the process you've seen before. It's an important part of our work. The reason why this is an important part of our work is it gives us the structure by which we make changes to the budget. I wish I could say that it's not unusual for us to get state budget numbers late, but just last year we did, right? We got them in the middle of July last year. And so we're actually fairly used to being flexible. We're actually fairly used to making assumptions in January and needing to revisit them in May and June. Obviously, this is a bit of an extreme scenario for us, but what this process that's laid out in these bullets does for us is it gives us an ability and a framework to work from within. So the budgeting goals and guiding principles remain. We made those together back in January. They remain our goals and our guiding principles for the work. The revenue forecast, the revenue assumptions remains part of the work for tonight, which then leads to our expenditure plan. So tonight, what we're doing is kind of going back through this cycle in a tight structure to get to the new version of our budget. Our draft preliminary budget was released in April. It's on our website. And as a reminder, that did not take into effect any effects from COVID. It would be nice to be able to assume that COVID-19 didn't happen. Unfortunately, it did. And our environment has changed with it. So we can no longer assume what we assumed back in January because we know COVID-19 happened and has had impacts. We assumed back in January through March that we would be getting $7.6 million of new funding, or what is a 1% budget increase. We knew then that it was short of our 1.8% inflation. We knew then that we were going to have to make difficult decisions to balance the budget. And in fact, you did that. You made very difficult decisions to cut $8 million in our budget and the wants and needs of the overall school district to balance this budget. Unfortunately, when COVID happened then, it made this revenue forecast change. So what we have in front of us are some assumptions that we're going to need to go into now in the environment that we know we're in COVID-19. So while there are a lot of unknowns, there's also some knowns. We know, as publicly reported, that the state is facing a $1.6 billion budget deficit. We know that the state funds education at the largest percentage of its overall budget. Therefore, we know it will be very difficult for the state to close their budget gap without adjusting our budget. Those are knowns. What is unknown is how far they're going to have to go. And that is primarily because we have public education advocates here in Madison, across the state, advocating on behalf of public schools at the state level and at the federal level. So hopefully there will be some really good advocacy work to protect us from these kind of impacts. But unfortunately, we can't rely on it. We can hope for it, but we can't rely on it. We have to contingency plan for the case that the state has to balance this budget using public education funding. We may end up better than this, but than the scenario B that I have in front of you, we may end up worse. We don't know. But what we know is the more flexibility that we have and the more contingencies that we can build in, the better we will be to respond between now and the fall, and to put students at the center and to protect students and to protect classroom environments. The decisions we make today can protect those investments. We can put our priorities first if we build in enough flexibility. So ultimately on the revenue strategy, what I'm recommending is that we move with scenario B. And so let me explain that one in more detail. There are 3 key revenue sources that we rely on. One is a per pupil categorical aid. This is a revenue tool that Governor Walker put in place that a good percentage of our revenue drives from. In this budget though, there's a $0 increase. So what we received last year is what we received this year. Scenario B assumes that they will not go negative in that particular area and instead will just remain at 0. They could go negative. Scenario B just assumes they stay at 0. Second category of revenue is the revenue limit per pupil. This was the public education funding tool prior to Governor Walker, and then the tool put back in place by Governor Evers. This tool was set to provide us with $179 per pupil. It was the primary revenue source in the slide I just showed you earlier. Because it's the primary new investment coming out of the state, that's the reason we're assuming it might be one of the primary levers that they bring down. They could bring it down from 179 to 100 to 50 to 0. They could also go to -50, -100, and -250. We don't know. We've seen school districts around the state planning for -50, -75. We see plenty of school districts around the state planning for 0. We see some more in the 100 category, but over 50% from kind of our loose check-in across the district, at least 50% are planning at $0 across the state. Then the third is the special education reimbursement rate. This was an area of investment at the state level and probably the closest investment tied to the state's growth projections that they would have projected back in 2019. Those projections did not come true. We know that for a fact. So this could be one of the easier levers, at least one of the more logical levers for them to pull if they have to. Now we know there's a strong advocacy base around there. So maybe they don't have to pull this. We don't know. But what we do know is that the revenue source at the state that was designed to fund this is no longer there. So scenario B remains my recommendation of the planning for our revenue. It could get better, it could get worse. That would give us a $7.6 million gap in Fund 10. What we also know is Fund 50, our food service, is not going to collect the revenues we would have otherwise anticipated in a more traditional environment next year. We haven't closed the books yet on 1920, but we're looking at a loss in Fund 50 for 1920 that we'll have to pull from fund balance at the end of the year in order to balance Fund 50 before we close this year's books out. When looking at projections from next year, using various models of what our fall might look like, we're looking at anywhere between a $1 million and a $2 million budget gap in Fund 50. Fund 50 legally has to balance. It's its own kind of entity. When you see the June budget, you'll see a negative balance at the $1.5 million gap. We'll have until October to resolve how that will be funded. And I'll talk about a little bit later on this presentation, some ideas around that. but I wanted to show it here so you can see the cumulative kind of effect of the two moving together, which is approximately $9 million moving together. So Chris, is this the time where you want me to pause for clarifying?
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Kelly. So does anybody have any clarifying questions at this point? And I can't see everybody, so please speak up if I'm not calling on you. I have a couple. First of all, I just want to make sure I'm doing this right. The $179 per pupil equals $6.2 million, correct?
$179 per pupil is about 6 million.
Okay, thanks. And secondly, I'm trying to understand the Fund 50 gap as it relates to the Fund 10 gap. I understand Fund 50 and that it's a revenue-based program, and we might need to use Fund 10 to cover Fund 50 shortfalls if we run into a big shortfall next year. However, you've got 1 million under scenario A, 1.5 million under scenario B, and 2 million under scenario C.
Yep.
Is it accurate to say that we could have scenario A with a 2 million Fund 50 gap, or scenario A with a 1.5 million Fund 50 gap? That the two are kind of independent of each other?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I think that's helpful to know.
Yeah. The range for Fund 50, it's really dependent on our fall decision making for like what models are in play by the fall.
And we will hear more about the Fund 50 fund balance later on in this presentation, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Any other questions? All right, I think we can move on, Kelly.
All right. So in line with our standard budgeting process, May and June are meant to focus on feedback on the April draft budget to give you information to adjust for June as needed. This year, we went through a similar process, which is typically going through all of our focus groups and releasing like a feedback button on our website. And we've done a survey for a couple years in a row now. I'm going to focus on our focus group feedback today because it was very representative and some really good conversations came out of our focus groups. Back in May, I updated you on the parent advisory group and principal advisory group. That meeting had already occurred by the last time we met last month. So this slide is the same, but the themes held through the rest of the focus groups that followed. So I wanted to bring it back to you again tonight. Those themes remain: put students at the center. That came up in every single conversation I had. Putting students at the center meant to just about every group, it came up with a definition that sounded something like student programming is going to be needed now more than ever. Mental health supports, social emotion supports, kind of like the clubs, the relationship building activities that kids are participate in matter now more than ever. And that relationship between the student and the staff member will matter more than ever for re-engagement, and particularly if we're back in any type of a virtual world because COVID spikes again or something, that opportunity for every student to have a trusting relationship is resonating very deeply with our community, parents, teachers, principals across the board. In addition to that, in the parent principal advisory group, a conversation came up that was worth noting around protecting class sizes, particularly as it relates to the low-income schools. And a conversation came up as it related to cleaning our schools and really protecting the budget associated with cleaning and maintaining our school buildings in light of COVID. And I think this really, that probably mirrors some of the conversation that Ananda put in, Ali and others put forward in the referendum conversation around making sure enough money is available for the safety aspects related to COVID. So that came up. When we were in front of SHRAC, they were very clear that student programming and support structures go first. And if that means that salary and staffing reductions need to happen, so be it, as long as the students went first. It was a very strong theme out of this particular group. With that said, the special education investments, the 5.8 FTE came up in light of the supports that our special education students will need in the fall, probably, you know, even more than had than previous before COVID. So that came up in a priority across all of our groups as well. Themes around mental health, social emotional health came up. Prioritizing inclusion over exclusion was a theme throughout the discussion. The referendum itself was also brought up in this conversation, some caution regarding the tax levy in light of the community today. That was reflected in the referendum discussion earlier today, and also reflected in the conversation earlier today was that, and there's a strong recognition that our student need is greater and that we have to fund that. So both the same challenges that we heard in the earlier conversation around student need came up in SHRAC as well. Across the special education advisory group, teachers advisory group, some similar themes between those two groups, with mental health investments going first, supporting the special education investments, and conversation just acknowledging the push and the pull between compensation and staffing levels. And primarily this is where the conversation regarding protecting that relationship that the student has with the teachers and other staff members right now is really one of the most important things. And when it came to parent voice, that's what the parents had to say, kind of first and foremost. The Teachers of Color Advisory Group would have reflected some of those same conversations, but had some additional highlights in light of our current environment today. And those would be protecting the equity work that the district has done through the professional development cycles, digging deeper, doing everything we can to push on the equity conversations through our professional development cycles remains an extremely important investment. In addition to that, retaining our diverse staff along with hiring a more diverse staff remains at the forefront of the priorities. They've been at the forefront of our priorities since the strategic framework was written, and they continue to come up in every single budget cycle I've done for 5 years. So, you know, hiring and retaining diverse staff remains top of priority, is in alignment with all the other feedback sessions that we've had probably for 5 years. So all of that then leads into the important decision making that's in front of you at this moment. Chris has already shared that maybe the way to think about the June budget is really that it's a draft budget that just gives us the authority to operate through July and August as we continue these conversations and make other decisions. The recommendation I have in front of you today is scenario A, and that's really to pause on any new spending in order to maintain the most flexibility until we know more. The areas that I've built into scenario A are the areas that needed that new revenue that we were reliant upon from the state, the $7.6 million that I started this conversation in, all went to compensation. The step movement and the base wage that we would have built into the draft April budget was entirely funded on new revenue from the state. So if the new revenue is not there, those new investments then would be one of the areas that we might need to look at. So pausing on those would give you the flexibility for the future. In addition to that, we repurposed within kind of central office decision-making our strategic equity projects. Now, a number of those you've already voted on and expenditures have already been tied, so some of those are off the table. However, those were all social, emotional, and mental health investments. The 4 new BHS clinics, for example. So they're all in line with the feedback that we got thus far in the budget. Those that are significant and not yet voted on are what's tied to the safety and security assistance, kind of the job realignment process. And then the large amount is the reading material purchase. So at this point, to maintain the most flexibility, I would recommend putting those on pause as well until you know more. So overall, that would give you about $8.4 million in flexibility. So if we're back in the $7.6 million range, it gives you room to move. But in this point time, you would hold that until we know more, and then we would build a new expenditure plan based on what we know when revenue comes in. At this moment, we do have 5 vacancies on hold at central office, positions that came open over the last month or two, not necessarily expected positions, and that we have on hold for kind of revenue discussions as well. So interested to know if those should remain on hold at this point, or if we should let those go. They would produce about $500,000 in flexibility if we were to continue to leave those on hold. If we were to move off of scenario A, we really don't have too much of another choice at this point, but to look at our positions and to identify what positions would need to remain or need to be put on hold or pause at the school level. Thus far, we have not put a single school-based position on hold for a lot of good reasons. One, staffing plans are already built at the school level. And so principals, this is their time to be hiring people. If we put things on hold and we get further into August, it's harder to hire. The other thing that we're noticing is HR can jump in here too when there's questions is, I mean, it's kind of a buyer's market because a lot of people, a lot of school districts have started to put their school-based hiring on hold. There's a lot of high quality graduating teachers available right now and diverse candidates that we would in a typical environment be in a highly competitive nature with our surrounding school districts. We might be able to pick up very high quality diverse staff in this environment that traditionally we're kind of in a competitive zone with. So there's also an HR strategy built into that as well. But if we're in scenario B and C, we'd have to start looking at those school-based positions in order to get to the kind of funding that we might need in order to balance the budget. So I'll kind of leave that there. Lisa's on the phone, Lisa's on Zoom, as is HR, and we can address any of the questions that you might have for us.
Kelly, are there any questions at this point? Kelly, I have one question, and that is, we talked about not wanting to put school level vacancies on hold at this point and that you haven't done that. How many, do you know how many school level vacancies we have at this point? Like how many positions are we trying to hire right now?
And not off the top of my head, Deirdre, is that something you have or something you would need to provide at another time?
Yeah, we're looking at the 150 to 175 range when we're talking about all of our school-based teaching positions that our team has just been continuously hiring for. And I think Kelly's right when we talk about quality and diversity, it's always about hiring early to make that happen. The longer we wait, the less high quality and diverse candidates you have. But we're in about the 150, 175 range right now.
And are those teaching positions or all school-based positions?
Majority of them are teaching positions, yes.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Chris, Ananda has a question. I don't know why I said my name in third person. Sorry about that. Kelly, what is the line item for the security staff salary adjustment?
It's about $160,000. So it's not the largest item on here by all means, but we do run into a bit of a kind of HR logistical challenge, which is if we're to hold on kind of the compensation, the majority of those costs are tied to the increase we had otherwise hoped to give the safety and security assistance. So you'd be kind of moving them pre any other decisions. And so it would be kind of cleanest for us if we moved everybody based on final decisions. If the safety and security assistant move is something the board wants to put first and foremost when we finalize the budget, we can do that. The board can always make decisions to back pay as well. Those would be decisions down the road for us. And Deirdre can jump in on the logistics, but to move the safety and security assistants now when we're not potentially not moving anyone else, it's a little tricky.
Right. And I don't need to get into the grains of it. And I appreciate just the amount of the line item and scratching my head to like remind myself that this is exactly where we did not want it to be at, in particular for that unit, because they've been waiting for a long time for significant salary like this is not a raise, right? This is a salary adjustment. So it feels really crappy to be again telling the largest number of people of color, unit of people of color in our district to continue to wait a few more months, as many other decisions are pending. But thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Ananda. Are there other questions?
Chris, I have a quick question. It's Chris, just with the closed vacant current positions, those 5 vacancies that you said are at central office, is that just happen to be a timing thing, or are these that the work that they're doing can actually wait, or it can be covered by other staff? I guess I'm curious how that works.
Yeah, so, I mean, sometimes central office positions don't have the same kind of urgency over the summer as a school position might, because we don't have that competitive nature of like, if you don't hire them now, you're going to lose them, because they tend to be more kind of just market-based jobs. Like if I had someone in my department, I'm looking for an accountant's available in August as much as they're available in June. So some of it's just that we can kind of afford to wait. And we have backup plans, and people are covering for these roles now. So waiting a couple more months would not hurt our ability to be prepared for the fall. It would not hurt our ability to support students in the fall. And that's how these positions got selected to be put on hold. When we have a vacancy review committee, that meets every year as part of our standard process. That's not new for this year. We have a set of priorities of positions that need to be funded. Schools come first. And then timing matters, equity strategies matter. And then we decide if we can really afford to wait. And that's how these got on the list.
Okay, thank you.
So I thought of one more question, but I want to make sure everybody else gets their questions answered first. So any others? Okay, so my other question, Kelly, and this might be hard to answer, but about, 15% of our budget is in capital expenses and supplies and things like that. In the face of COVID, it feels like that piece of the budget is perhaps in as much upheaval as everything else. On one hand, we may have higher expenses for fixing all the sinks or for making sure we have adequate hand sanitizer and cleaning supplies in our schools. On the other hand, nobody may go to a conference next year. So I'm kind of wondering what kind of assumptions went into budgeting that 15% of the budget. Did you kind of assume with give and take, it would stay about the same? Are you assuming that some expenses will be a lot higher? Because that influences the overall expenditure picture. I know the main lever is staffing, but that's also
for sure. So in the appendix to this slide, in the appendix to this presentation, you'll see a slide that explains what I'm saying, but I'm not going to scroll down to it for time's sake. So the 15% of the budget that you're referring to is largely funded by just a few things. Most of it goes to fixed expenses that we cannot impact. That's the private school vouchers, that's our 2X charter payments. Can't impact it, at least in the short run. Utility bills, there may be some savings, as Lee kind of pointed out in the earlier presentation, pretty fixed in the short run. Perhaps there is some savings there, but if we're running any type of a 50-50 model or something, a virtual model of any sort, or any sort of an in-person model, the lights are going to be on, the building's going to be running. Utilities are fixed cost, no matter how many kids are in the building. So there's not going to be a lot of savings for utilities. After that, it's largely transportation. Those expenses are only going up. We know that. And then you have Chad's building and services budget, which is already grossly underfunded, and those expenses are going up. The tiny little piece of the pie that's left, that's 13% of the 13%, is everything else you can think of. So even though there might be some savings in conferences, it's not a large percentage of it. It's not even a drop in the bucket percentages of Fund 10. Most conferences are funded by external grants and sources. Our food budget, I know, likes to come up, tiny dollar amounts here. Mileage, tiny dollar amounts. Sure, there's going to be a little bit of savings in mileage. Yes, there's going to be a little bit of savings in food if people aren't together in the same way. But between the three things you just said, or we just said, conferences, food service, mileage, $150,000 in savings. I mean, the numbers are so small and our expenses are so big when it comes to COVID response.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I think we can move on.
Okay, all right. So talking about the rest of the budget, as Chris mentioned earlier, we'll come back to the decision making, but I do think it's important for you to realize that all of our federal funding that we rely on is not moving in the right direction with us either. It's not only not keeping up with inflation, we actually see pretty significant reductions in Title I and in other titles as well. And I'll let, I know Lisa's gonna jump in here just to explain this portion of it a little bit. But it's important for you to know that we're gonna have to rework our title plans to cover that gap, and we'll redo it looking at the central kind of district-wide allocation, keeping school allocations as whole as possible. Lisa, do you have some more to add here?
Yeah, just a little bit, Kelly. Thank you. Title I, we got our grant estimate. Please know that it is just an estimate still as of yet. And it's about a $329,000 reduction. That compared to the reduction we took last year is close to $1 million in a reduction in Title I. Title II, we went down about 38,000 this year. We also took a cut last year. That's the title that primarily funds professional development, teacher mentors, our work with educator effectiveness. Title IV, we haven't seen a significant change yet. And then Title III, we don't know yet. But just a couple of things to know about Title I. Primarily, Title I, our principals spend that money on staffing, on FTE. That this is a dollarized budget. So when salaries go up, right, the pool can't spread as far. So your money doesn't go quite as far. We are a district that primarily pushes out our Title I dollars to the schools on a per pupil basis in a tiered way. And we try to focus our money on the schools that have the highest percent of poverty. And then we actually allocate all the way down to the district average. So I would anticipate as we go into this next year, we'll be having a conversation about that at the board level to determine if indeed that is the targeted strategy that we want to continue to use. What happens as the total award goes down, as salaries go up, obviously the money gets spread a little bit thinner, and our highest poverty schools generally take a hit in terms of funding around that. So something to look at. Also, we've maintained a pretty healthy carryover in Title I, and with this reduction, we'll see a smaller carryover. We've been trying to protect ourselves from year to year, but I think we'll see a little bit tighter carryover moving into next year. So Jennifer Waldner, our state and federal programs director, when Title III comes in, we'll put this together for you so you have a whole package that goes along with the funding that we get from the federal level in these title program areas.
Thank you, Lisa. So next kind of topic to make sure we all get a clearer picture on before you see in the June budget is our COVID-19 CARES Act funding. So we have received information from DPI that Madison will receive $5.2 million. What we don't know is what MMSD will receive out of the $5.2 million yet. And that is primarily because of the discussion and debate that's happening between the federal level and the state level, and even Congress and the Department of Education regarding how private and parochial schools are funded via CARES Act funding. And we really need to know what that guidance is finalized before we know our final number. So for example, if the ruling comes down that private and parochial schools will be funded for all enrollment, all private parochial schools that apply are eligible for their entire enrollment, but we are funded based on low-income Title I eligibility. There's an inequality in that. We'd be closer to the $4.2 million range, so or somewhere on that end of the range. If private parochial schools are funded based on low-income percentages, and we're funded based on those low-income percentages, we're both kind of using the same equation, then we'll probably be funded at the higher end, at more closer to the $4.7 million range. So that's the reason why we're working from a range right now. I suspect we'll know that by July, when we actually can fill out the application to receive from some of this funding. So it's important to know that we don't have a dollar in our hand right now. There's no application system, no way to get any of the funding just yet. That's coming. When we do have the ability to kind of go into the system and start putting in our budgets, we will have more needs than we have funding. Based on the 1920, where we're at right now is about $2.5 million spent. It'll be just north of that by the time June wraps up and we close the budget books. At a minimum for expenses right now, budgeting $3 million. We don't yet have a solidified fall plan, so we can't yet put a fall budget together. But based on just known expenditures to date, not even considering the detailed model, it's at least $3 million of which we would need for 2021. Looking at some of the kind of statistics and formulas that have been put out there by the National Association of Superintendents and others lately, this a dollar amount could be as high as $7 to $10 million, especially by the time if you were to try to add school days back into next school year or the school year after, or try to totally reimagine summer school for next summer. Those things have high dollar amount costs into it. So this $3 million is a basic minimum to get the safety items that we need, the masks, the thermometers, perhaps some of the kind of plexiglass that Ananda had mentioned earlier in our earlier conversation, along with some of the interventions and virtual learning supports that we would need. So we have some examples of some of the expenditures that we know are coming, listed in those beautiful colored boxes right there, but $3 million is a minimum. And then we know we have 21, 22 expenses that we can't even necessarily predict yet. So what we know is that we're not going to have enough. The plan, when you see the budget book, will be to use some of the funding that we're receiving to potentially backfill the 1920 expenditures. But we will likely just take a hit on some of those $2.5 million expenditures in the 1920 budget in order to save funding for the 2021 budget, where we're going to need it most to make sure that we get fall started on the right foot. We know we have to get fall right. And so we need to save as much of the COVID funding as we can for 2021. There's potentially some hope that we'll see another bill come from the federal level. That would matter. That would matter a lot for the conversations we were having in the previous meeting, but we don't know. We haven't seen the Senate kind of pick up the House bill yet. And we've seen some conversations happening in the Senate, but nothing that's really telling us this funding's coming. We know the state's looking closely at it too, so we'll just have to wait and see. But what you'll see is some funding for COVID being used to balance 1920, and then a large piece of the COVID being put into the budget, the June budget, for expenditures for the 2021. And we need to do that now so that the teams, Chad in particular, can start putting in his orders. Because if we don't put those orders in now, they won't get here by fall for the kind of safety equipment we need. So you'll see it in the budget. So kind of be ready and on the lookout for that. So I've hit a majority of the things to be on the lookout for the June budget that are kind of all new and late breaking thanks to COVID. I've mentioned Fund 50 already. Our strategy to close the Fund 50 gap will be to use a couple different strategies. One, when vacant positions become available, we will likely freeze them for the year to just help reduce some of the expenditures. Two, we'll have to use Fund 50 fund balance to close the 1920 gap and to use some of it to fund the 2021 gap. In addition to that, we may have to use some COVID funding and or a Fund 10 transfer. We're waiting to see where final 1920 balances land to see how much of the fund balance is going to be needed for 1920 at this point. But they will not, they will end up finishing the year in the red. Fund 80 community service, the goal and the strategy there is to balance the 2021 budget on their own expenditure reductions. We saw $1.3 million in revenue losses out of our Fund 80 community service budget due to canceled programs. They will finish the year pretty close to even because of expenditure savings that they put into place immediately back in March. And then a number of expenditures they reduced for their summer plans when a lot of the summer was. So attempting to balance this year and next year off of expenditure reductions alone in that one fund. Cash flow borrowing timeline is going to be a bit different. We'll go in August instead of September this year. So know that that's on the horizon. And then the other big shift that you'll see in the June budget that's tied to the policy that's attached to this presentation is regarding just strategy around fund balance. So in the policy that's attached to these materials, there's two changes related to each other. One is we redlined out something about assigned fund balance that is no longer eligible under GAAP. So there's just some old language that we deleted because it's no longer legal or allowed. So that's one change in there. Two is to revise the language around the authority to assign. Now, assigned fund balance is a term in accounting, but it's different than the term committed. The term committed is when you vote to commit money to something and it's kind of locked in there and it cannot change unless the board votes and the board changes the whole budget, which would take a 2/3 majority of the board to do that. Pretty big deal. We typically only use that when it's required by law. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about assigned, which is done more for transparency's sake. Since we're walking into COVID with funding that's likely to be multi-year scenarios at this case, 1920, 2021, 21, 22, we get new funding, maybe even 22, 23. I think it's going to be very important that we track this funding and that it's transparent how the rollover happens. As you all know, I'm still fairly new. And the three other projects on this list happened before I was in this role. The $5 million for safety and security is a project that started 4 years ago, got about $500,000 left. I'm suggesting that we put that last bit in assigned fund balance as well as we burn that down for the rest of the year, because that's where that money is going to be spent in the encumbrances already there in Chad's department. Fund TID 25 projects, similarly, there's a couple $1 million left, about $2 million in TID 25 that will roll over into next year that we would put in assigned fund balance. So it's clear that that's TID 25 projects. And then we have the funding for the Holtzman remodel. That remodel is underway. All the money has already been committed through consent memos that this board has approved. So creating this new kind of way of working around fund balance is not only more transparent to the public, it's easier for us as we talk about rollover funds at the end of the year every year. I think it's just more transparent about what our fund balance is, and it'll help us work in tighter ways moving forward. So knowing that COVID's coming, I think now is just a good time to tighten up that particular process. All right, so that is a ton of information, as Chris warned you about. My last slide is a timeline slide, but you are all well aware that you're voting at the end of the month, that we're going to be working together through July and September to vote on a final budget in October. So I'll hand this over to Chris to help facilitate us through the meeting.
First and foremost, thank you, Kelly. That was a lot of work. So thank you for getting all this in one place for us so we can make informed decisions.
Yeah.
I wanted to start out by inviting general questions and also an opportunity for board members to give Kelly specific feedback on her COVID strategy, which she mentioned we have some money that we are getting from the CARES Act. We're uncertain about the HEROES Act or other proposed federal funding to help us cover our COVID expenditures. And as a result, she outlined a strategy that works with those numbers, assuming expenses will be higher than revenue. So if you have feedback for Kelly on that piece, specific piece, as well as general questions at this point, let's get all that on the table. And again, I can't, is it okay to take the slides down or do people need them? Because I can't see people to call on them, but let's try taking the slides down. Cool. So, all right, discussion. I would be happy to start us off since everybody's being quiet. So Kelly, I did have a question about Fund 50 and the Fund 50 fund balance, just for my own education about this. I looked at the budget and it looked like the Fund 50 fund balance has around 1.4 million spendable in it, but I don't know what that actually means. Like, do we actually want to spend all the spendable money in the Fund 50 fund balance? I know we don't have a policy like we have for Fund 10 for Fund 50. I just want to get your thoughts on that. Like, how much money do we actually have in fund balance?
Yeah, good question. You are really close, and so we'll use that $1.4 million number. Fund 50 fund balance operates a little different than Fund 10. We don't rely on it for cash flow in the same kind of way. It's typically used to fund emergency, like refrigerators, for example, go out, like unplanned food truck breaks down, a new one needs to get purchased because it's, do not resuscitate truck. Those kind of emergencies happen to fund balance or to food service. And since food service has to self-balance, they keep the fund balance for, their emergency uses. In the refrigerator example, those are very expensive refrigerators. That's probably the most common example that of what they would use it for. So using some of it to help right now, obviously we wish we wouldn't need to, but it's not a horrible strategy for the short term. I would not want to, bring it down to zero. I don't think that's a good idea because they do have emergencies every year, of some sort or another that they're having to work with, and they have very, very tight margins. You might recall that last year they finished a little bit in the red too because of our winter days. They just run tight margins. And so there's a lot they need to be planning for, or when they have unplanned expenses, there's not a lot there to help. And so the fund balance is what they rely on. So I would not go to zero, which is why we need to see where they end up the year, how much we're going to have to use for 1920 before we fully decide what we put into the 2021 budget. So the overall strategy is not yet finalized because we don't know how 1920 is going to finish yet.
So just to clarify, in the revenue scenarios that you put forward, when you said we had somewhere between a 1 and 2 million gap in Fund 50, was that after taking money out of the Fund 50 fund balance or before?
Before.
Okay, thank you. I saw Ananda's hand, so no? Okay. Other questions, clarifications? Sabian.
Yeah, it's just, well, thank you, Kelly, for that really detailed presentation. I just had trying to wrap my head around the multi-year fiscal year budgeting and how those issues or how the years run into each other without, reimbursements yet, and how we solve those issues. Does that make sense?
Yeah, on COVID in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a good question. So we won't have any funding when the kind of year closes in June. It all depends on how the timing goes with DPI. Potentially we'll have funding that we'll be able to still use for the June month end or year end close. It just depends on the timing. Assuming that we don't though, it means that all the expenses we've used on COVID net against our revenue at the end of the day. And we have had, expenditure controls. We've talked about that a couple of meetings now. Back in March, we put an expenditure control plan in place to reduce our expenses wherever possible. We're saving on some salary savings for the positions we haven't filled, for example. So we have some savings that'll help net against that. And the goal will be to use kind of the least amount of fund balance that we can out of the Fund 10, 19, 20 budget. And once we have kind of all of those numbers balanced, which won't happen until July. That's how our year-end work happens. It all comes in, we balance it all out in July and August. Then we'll know how deep the fund balance is hit. And we'll know how much of COVID we want to use versus how much we want to save. So we'll make some of those decisions, but for the most part, we're going to try to save most of the money for 2021, as long as Fund 10, 19, 20 doesn't take a horrible hit.
Okay. And then my last question is, do we have any projections for students and seats on the third Friday of September? Because I know that'll be a variable for us.
It's a big variable. We don't know until our third Friday counts in September. We get some inklings in August when enrollment happens. Right, there's certain number of kids that we expect should be enrolling. And if we're under enrolled in August, it starts to give us some information, and we use that every year to help us gauge where we're at and where we're headed. But I do think we need to be paying very closely to enrollment and decisions that families might be making as it relates to our fall plans as well. So we kind of take the 27,000 number for granted, but September enrollment will matter.
Chris?
Yeah, I have a question on the title funding. It sounds like this isn't the first year that we've had a decrease in this. When that does happen, do we shift funding from other areas to cover that decrease, given that it sounds like it does go to our highest poverty schools, or how does that work, or how do you envision that sort of working? Without knowing certainly without knowing for sure that this is just an estimate and it's not our final number on this.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chris. Jennifer Waldner budgets fairly conservatively off of a lower amount of a grant than we generally get. And so she generally keeps a nice cushion and carryover. And then she also budgets so that there is some left in the grant, so that we aren't sort of, draining all the money and not having any left. So we don't want to hold, there's a balance, right? We don't want to hold too much back that schools can't plan, but we also, Jennifer has great relationships with DPI. She figured we go down a little bit this year. So we're in a good place. I think this year we have a little bit less carryover. I think the place to have a larger discussion sometime next fall is the strategy around Title I. Do we believe as an equity strategy, we want to target our resources to the highest poverty schools in the district in a different way through a different tiered approach? Then I think you get a little more flexibility with a potential smaller award that might come through from the state.
Okay, thanks.
Gloria?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So just to have a quick question on the COVID-19 CARES Act funding and the projected expenditures. Kelly, have you or anybody else, have you guys talked about any potential expertise in a position of some sort to have us transition back into school? I'm just thinking, I know we rely heavily on public health, right? And so they will offer us their expertise, but I'm just wondering if there was any thought about if we're going to need some sort of, and I can't think of one right now, but what does transition back into school look like? And if we're going to need a special person with the expertise to help us do that. Or we're just relying on our current staff?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Jane probably has a lot to say here. I just want to make sure everyone realizes the talent we have in Sally Zerbaldanovich. She is an incredible resource on our team. And if you don't know Sally, I talked to her. She is our main liaison, kind of back to all of her experts. And, you know, I honestly think we have what we need in Sally's expertise. As it relates to the public health side of things. As far as it relates to Chad's world, he's still on, I think, and can jump in. But there's a lot of trade association kind of groups forming around each one of us in our roles right now. And Chad's getting a lot of help and resources from within those groups. There's a statewide transportation group, for example. So Chad, if you want to add more.
Yeah, Kelly, so we are part of, I meet weekly, just saw Mike Berry this afternoon before our meeting with kind of counterparts in my world. There are actually some business directors on this group, just trying to do what we can to coalesce with our best thinking around what's going to happen in the fall. It sounds like DPI is going to hand out some guidance on Monday that will give us some more clarity around what transportation and our facilities look like. And then really what we're hearing is that guiding source for what schools look like in the fall will actually be county health authorities. And that's where Sally really thrives, where she's got a direct partnership with them and has been working with them for decades. And we'll build our plan around DPI guidance starting, and then all of the networking we're doing. But I think what we're hearing is every school district is going to have to make their own decision around what's best for their kids and their community. And our plan will probably look different, slightly different than other plans in the county, but they'll all be in line with what county health providers are telling us. On the call I had today, you know, Mike Berry's representing business directors and superintendents that are in counties where there might only be 1 or 2 cases of COVID. And their plan is going to look way different than the plan we have in Madison. And that's just the reality of where we're at. So we have to be flexible, stay as informed as possible, and make sure we communicate what things are going to look like in the fall as soon as we know.
I would just add too, we have a really excellent planning team and a planning model going for the last 3 weeks or so. We've been meeting pretty much every single day and 2 days a week for 4 or 5 hours as a team, really going through our project plan, getting that up and going. We did a project design. We have our principles. We're looking at the equity tool. We're looking at building a table of contents. So pretty soon we'll have some real concrete ideas to share. But yeah, I think all of us are connected with, you know, we're talking with the mayor, county exec, we're with the 5 big districts in the state, and all of the, as Kelly mentioned, all of the organizational supports that we have. Everybody's really trying to come together in the best way that we can. And the DPI guidance is going to be pretty comprehensive, although, as Chad was pointing out, that guidance has to fit the whole state. So we're all going to have to find our place in that. But I think it will be a good umbrella, and I think we've got some good initial planning in place. We're working on a pretty extensive communication strategy too. So that's going to be as important as anything, is to start, you know, communicating how we are planning and what we are thinking. So we've kind of been waiting on the DPI plan, knowing that it's coming on Monday is really nice, and hopefully we'll be moving along even faster once we get that.
Great, thank you all for that. Kelly, do we know whether the CARES Act funding is going to be for specific things? Like, yeah.
I mean, it has to be for COVID related expenses. So it can't be used for a salary increase, right? It can't be used just because you want to add a social worker. Those would not be eligible. But as it relates to like academic acceleration, There are a number of instructional kind of strategies that can be funded through it. From an expenditure standpoint, that probably looks like extended employment. Maybe some teachers picking up some extra hours, other ways of working that might be, needed to be funded outside of contract time. So it might look like that. It might look like LTE, meaning bringing back some retired folks to help provide supports. It could look like that. For sure, in Chad's world, it will look like masks, thermometers, big sanitizing equipment, loads of hand sanitizer, transportation, investments of some sort or another. Obviously, you have to negotiate those with our transportation provider. So it'll be pretty tangible in Chad's world. Then over in Lisa's world, you'll be looking at special education costs that IDA, which might not be able to pick up, as supports for kind of bilingual education and a virtual, some potential virtual learning world. So you'll see expenses, but they're really directly tied to supports in the COVID world. Lisa, you probably have much better examples than I do at the tip of your tongue.
Yeah, I think we've got a large curriculum group planning this summer. I think that we want to plan, we've been getting lots of emails about a Black history class in the high school. So there's lots of work I think that needs to be done on the instructional side yet. And we want teachers to be part of it. So we want to be able to pay them.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Fabian.
So just to conceptualize, it sounds like where relief is at right now, that there is high likelihood of reimbursement for COVID related expenses, but not any type of relief for just lost tax revenue due to the economic fallout.
That's the current thinking, even if the feds do come up with some sort of a plan for this to help the states, we don't know what's going to filter from the states down to us.
Yeah. Yeah, this is just not an ideal situation for anybody, but.
Ollie.
Yeah, Chris, I think your original point starting the meeting is really driven home in this conversation in terms of planning for the draft budget, which I think is almost advertisement for the necessity of the referendums. And I think it speaks to our need to be agile and also very realistic. And so I agree with Kelly that kind of plan B, that zero-based budget planning, in which we're, anything we're adding, we're looking at making a cut, is kind of the reality we need to navigate moving forward. And I think really examining, how to do that in a way that is the most supportive of our young people is what we're hearing from everybody, including our educators. And in some ways, that's a really beautiful thing. And also, it's an intense moment of strain for our entire system. And so I appreciate folks for absorbing that gracefully at this time. And I hope that the option B, which I think is still kind of an optimistic option, allows for us to navigate the draft budget with a sense of clarity.
Thanks for that, Ollie. And that's actually a transition into the next part of our conversation. But before we go there, I want to make sure, like, Ananda, you haven't had any general questions or spoken about the COVID budget. Did you want some time? Are you good?
No, I think I've already said it before, Chris. Thank you for calling out. I think I said what I need to say in an item before, so I don't have anything else to add. And I agree with what my colleagues have already shared. Thank you.
And Kelly, I had one more clarification about the COVID strategy. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to wrap my head around how Fund 10 fund balance, Fund 10, and the federal money all kind of work together as a bunch of moving parts to cover COVID expenses that probably exceed the federal revenues. So for this fiscal year, I assume we're pulling from fund balance because we're not probably even going to see the federal money in time to pay the bills. Is that correct?
Yeah, we don't know yet. June hasn't even ended, so I can't predict exactly how 1920 ends. There's a lot of moving parts. There's revenue we haven't even received yet that, you know, should be coming any day now. So a lot of moving parts. I don't know if 1920 will finish for sure in the red or, you know, finish really tight, particularly if we can get the COVID funding and kind of use it. Still in the accounting timeline to fund 1920. So still a lot of open questions there. 1920 will close itself out. We'll either use 500,000, a million, or 1.5 million out of the COVID funding to get 1920 to close. We'll use as little as we can. That's the strategy to get it to close at a reasonable point, so that we can save as much as we can for 2021. And it won't roll through fund balance because we haven't yet expended the 2021 expenses, so we can't get the reimbursement yet. All that will happen in 2021. We'll just book revenue because we expect to receive money for COVID in 2021, and we'll book expenses in Chad's world and in Lisa's world that will net COVID to zero. Revenue and expenses will equal each other within COVID in 2021. If we have more expenses, we're going to need to use our departmental budgets to repurpose to fund it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I'm kind of wondering, like, it seems like you're also planning to like try to save a little bit of the federal money to roll into 21, 22, correct?
I'm hoping.
I'm kind of wondering the rationale behind that strategy. Like we're, you know, unless we get more federal money, we're either going to have to use general fund departmental budgets to cover the difference. General fund money is flexible and responsive. So if it turns out we get more money from the federal government or expenses aren't as high as we thought, we can use that money for other stuff. Whereas federal money is not. We have to use it for COVID related expenses. So I'm just curious why we're not kind of front loading the COVID expenses to maintain the flexibility in Fund 10 later, as opposed to like having fixed money moving and using the Fund 10 money earlier. Does that make sense?
We can, yeah, we could. It's really just a matter of fiscal years and how things roll over. So whatever we don't use for 1920, we could all book it in 2021 as
it just
revenue.
Seems to me that given the rigidity of the federal money, spending it earlier,
yeah,
and keeping the flexible money for later might make sense.
It largely, for me, it largely depends on what our fall planning ends up looking like and what the budget needs at the end of the day end up looking like. And I just don't know yet because the fall plan isn't done. But if we wanted to go into June with a strategy of booking it all into 2021, we can do that.
At this point, how much Fund 10 money do you think you're going to be allocating to COVID expenses in the June budget book?
The revenue of which we have. There's no new money. So we have, if we book it all, let's just say $4 million for 2021. And so we would book $4 million worth of potential expenditures. We would drop some of it into Chad's budget, some of it in Lisa's budget. And then by the time you see it in October, it'll all be redone because it'll then be tied to an actual fall plan.
Okay. So
for now, the only reason for budgeting it now is so we can buy things.
So between now and between October, we might actually be freeing up some Fund 10 money because it will be covered by federal funding? Or because we'll have a better sense of our COVID expenses?
Because we'll have a better sense of the COVID expenses from 1920.
Okay, so it's possible we could have a little bit more flexibility moving into the September budget when we know more about COVID spending and federal funding.
Yep, it'll all be rebalanced for October, that's for sure. And yes, it's possible it could go up a bit.
Thank you. It's kind of complicated and I appreciate your helping me wrap my head around it.
Yeah.
All right. We are going to move into a discussion of the two decision points that we need to make in this meeting. And the first one is a decision about which revenue assumption we want to make.
Chris, can I put the slides back up for everybody?
Yes, and the only thing is that with doing that, I can't see everybody, but I will call on people. So I think that will help a little bit. So the revenue forecast, we've got the April budget best case, which we know is not true anymore. Then we've got scenario A, which is a $6.2 million gap in Fund 10. Scenario B, which is a $7.6 million gap in Fund 10, and scenario C, which is a $9 million gap in Fund 10. And I would really urge people to don't get caught up in the weeds of where that gap is coming from. Like at the end of the day, if it's coming out of special ed or if it's coming out of other categorical aids or revenue limit, it's a gap. It's money we don't have. So this is our, we have to base our expenditures based on the revenue forecast we decide to roll with. Kelly's going to build the whole budget around whichever letter here we decide to tell her to go with. So I'm going to do a quick round robin and just call on people to tell me what your thinking is at this point about which scenario you think we should go with. And at the end, if it seems like we need to do a quick show of hands just to get a real, a strong sense of where the consensus lies, we'll do that as well, because it's possible during the course of the discussion, you might change your mind. So that's kind of how I want to facilitate this one. So let's start out with Gloria. What is your thinking about these three scenarios and where do you think you land?
So I'm in scenario B.
Ananda?
Yeah, again, to reinstate that none of those scenarios are where we wanted to be today, but I agree with the recommendation from administration for scenario B.
Ollie, you've already said B, but if you change your mind, let us know.
Thank you so much, Chris. I spoke to this and I stand with what I said a few moments ago.
Savian?
Yep, I stand with B and maintaining as much flexibility.
Chris?
Yes, I would agree with that too. And I just want to echo Ananda's sentiment that this is not where any of us would like to be at this point. But thank you, Kelly, for laying this out and showing us these options, given all the uncertainty that still exists. So yeah, I'll agree with the scenario B.
Nikki, I'm not going to call on you because of your request to abstain from this conversation, but if you decide you want to speak to this, please chime in. I don't want to silence you. I actually fall in scenario A. I'm going to be the outlier. Given the fact that Governor Evers has publicly said, I don't think this is going to play out, that he doesn't want to do a budget repair bill, and the fact that we're not in the same boat as we were in the 2011-2013 biennial budget. We have a governor at the helm who is very supportive of public education. I don't think we're going to see cuts as drastic as scenario B. I think scenario A is probably a reasonable conservative estimate of where we might land. So I'm going to put in my vote for scenario A. I'm not going to assume that I swayed a majority of the board to agree with me, but that's where I land.
Okay, thank you. Chris, would you like me to go to the expenditure slide?
Yes, that would be really helpful.
So if when I build the budget book, literally probably start working on it tonight, I will drop the revenue assumptions in line with where the majority of us fall tonight. But what that does mean is that we need our expenditures to balance. So with a revenue decrease, when we vote together in June, the budget will have to balance to an expenditure plan that's $7.6 million less. So with that in mind, my kind of suggested strategy is scenario A that provides the most flexibility and reserves some funding for you to make future decisions on, even in the environment that we're in scenario B, that if it's a better scenario, be able to give kind of more back, move closer to the April version of the budget. Or even if it gets a little bit worse, you'll have some flexibility, or if it remains where it is right now, you would still have a little bit to give back as it relates to building priorities for the fall.
Thanks, Kelly. So we're going to use the same process for this. Go around, get your feedback on which scenario you are the most comfortable with. If you want to say why, go for it. If not, you don't have to. And if we don't have a clear consensus at the end, we'll do a show of hands. So Gloria, where are you landing?
I think, I do like the flexibility provided in scenario A. So that's where I'm at.
Ananda?
Yeah, similar to President Gloria, I think at this point, we really needed to lean into flexibility. I hear you, Chris, around our governor support, not only that, and like the fact that he's an educator, former state superintendent of education. So I'm with you 100%. Although like what we have seen is other pressures that play a role into like what is the budget. And I don't feel like I'm in that space that I trust Wisconsin from that regard, so.
Oh, Ollie, sorry.
What all that chewing?
I know. I'm like, I gotta fit dinner into this. I think scenario A allows for the greatest flexibility. Yeah.
Savian?
Yeah, I think, scenario A is where I'm at, and yeah, really not happy with, where things are, but, COVID has upended everything, including our budget. And so really hoping that we can build it back up as we move into the year or the new fiscal year.
Chris?
Yeah, I will agree with that scenario A. I really appreciate this being explained as a pause while we still have this uncertainty around our funding and the flexibility that this provides. Really choosing between, the pause on the salaries versus laying off staff and losing those positions. So yeah, I agree with scenario A.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to, again, be the outlier, and I'm going to go with scenario B, and I'm going to give you my explanation why. First of all, I think we're going with a revenue assumption that assumes too much scarcity, but I'm the only one who fell in that camp, so I will roll with the revenue assumption we decided on. I am very, very uncomfortable putting our steps on pause. I am okay with putting base wage on pause until we know more about the state budget, but I'm not comfortable with doing that with steps. And the reason why is that in the fall and across the summer, to deal with COVID, we're going to be asking a lot of our staff. Our teaching staff, we mentioned Sally Zerbel-Donish and our nursing staff and the amazing work that they're doing and how much we're going to be asking of them to be flexible and responsive and put in a lot of extra work and time because of COVID. They're going to be reworking curricula. They're going to be putting more stuff online. They're going to be taking kids' temperatures at the door. They're going to be trying to figure out how to isolate kids who might have COVID symptoms in the schools. Because we're going to be asking so much of our staff, we want them coming into the school year with maximum creativity and enthusiasm, and saying that we're cutting their steps without actually going to MTI and other employee groups and asking them, how do you want to approach this crisis? I think is going to put morale in a very bad place at a time when we need morale at peak. And so for that reason, I really don't think right now we can pause our steps and ask as much of our staff as we're going to be asking of them, and also ask them to cover more of their health benefits. So for that reason, I would recommend going with scenario B, and with the caveat that in the next 2 weeks, we go to MTI and we go to our other represented groups and we say, what are your thoughts? And if they say to us, put our steps on hold, I'm totally happy to roll with that.
Chris, may I just add just one more thing? There's some comment, I do appreciate where you're at, and you're trying to be hopeful and you're trying to making sure that our staff really feel the sentiments that I'll make an assumption that we all feel very similar, but there was some comments that were a little bit deceiving that you just made, and I wanted to clarify that it's not the fact that I am choosing scenario A is not that I don't want our staff to have high morale. It's not that I don't feel like that we should be investing on them. specifically during this time, if any other time. I have been really voicing my opinion about making sure that we have the most savings when we did the vote for insurance, and to make sure that we don't continue to pass the cost of what's happening right now to our staff. And so we're choosing scenario A is not saying that we are not supporting steps. It's just saying that we are deferring making that decision until we know more information, which is a prudent thing, not just because we care about our staff, but because we care about our district. Otherwise, what matters if we secure the steps for everyone and then we have to get to a mass layoff? So I just wanted to clarify where my position is actually at in response to what you just said.
Thanks, Sananda. I appreciate that. And I didn't mean to imply at all that other people were thinking the opposite of what I just said. That was just my own thinking. So I really appreciate your clarification. Do others want to chime in at this point? One thing I didn't mention in my comments was the fact that if we do put both steps and base wage on hold, and we're going for a $6 million ask in the first year of the operating referendum, we actually don't have enough money in the operating referendum to build those two things in. So that was another consideration that I had when thinking about putting both steps and base wage on hold. So Kelly, do you feel like you have the feedback you need at this point on those two big questions?
I do, thank you. The last bit of clarity I might like is just making sure Savion has asked a question about as it related to that assigned fund balance. That was super helpful. Before we kind of close out, I just want to make sure there's no other questions to the assigned fund balance, or maybe just offer that it's a pretty technical conversation. And if anybody wants to call and talk through it in the upcoming week, know that I'm here. It's a pretty accounting technical conversation. But if there's any concerns around using an assigned fund balance process, maybe share those right now, because it is very much tied into the work that I start literally tomorrow morning.
And Kelly, I just want to clarify, does it make sense to talk about that now or when we talk about the policy in just a minute?
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot you were going there. It definitely makes sense when we go to the policy.
I mean, we can do both.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm up for
Yes,
clarification whenever it makes sense. So.
Yep.
Okay. So this is, a last call for any clarifications, questions. This is our last chance as a group to discuss these things before we vote in 2 weeks. Again, you can always reach out to Kelly individually if you've got questions in the meantime. But if anyone has questions now, please chime in. Ananda, I see your hand.
Kelly, how much change are you anticipating in the next 2 weeks in regards to state communication?
None.
If at all? Yeah, okay.
No,
I didn't
I've
think so.
asked 3 or 4 different sources, and along with the governor's latest quotes, I don't think we'll see anything until early August, end of July.
Okay. Thank you so
I
much.
think we're going to have some quiet weeks.
I can't see everybody, so if you got a question, feel free to just chime in.
Oh, I can stop sharing this.
Okay, cool. Kelly, one question I have is, when do you anticipate we'll get a revised budget book?
Yeah. You guys, it typically takes a month to create that puppy. And we're attempting to turn it around in a week. So I'm hoping to have drafts for you, just to answer questions, probably early to mid next week. But I don't know that it'll be available in final draft for the public until our typical posting process.
I think I speak for the whole board when I express that we are incredibly grateful for the hours you are putting in to handle this crisis and get us information. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It'll be a crunch couple weeks, but the guidance you all gave me tonight helps me know that I'm working on one path, and that's incredibly helpful right now with everything else moving. making sure that it all actually ties out and balances at the end of the day is my next goal for you. And I will stay in touch over the next 2 weeks, but I greatly appreciate the work you've done tonight.
All right, well, let's close out this part of the conversation and move on to what should be a pretty quick discussion about a policy change. And Kelly, you're leading that, right?
Yeah, so I'm not even going to pull it up because you all have access to it. It's 2 tiny little word changes. I mentioned earlier, the cross line part is simply something that when I reviewed it this week, my comptroller and I looked at each other, we're like, that's not even allowed anymore. So took the opportunity to cross out what's not even legally allowed anymore via GAP, and then added in the language that would be required to really create an assigned fund balance. And again, the purpose of that is when we have multi-year commitments, something like the TID, where we have multiple projects that scan over 4 or 5 years, when it's just falls to fund balance and rolls over, it creates a lot of confusion for all of us at that end of year process and then rebudgeting. It essentially kind of overstates the fund balance at particular times of the year. And so by creating an assigned fund balance, it creates more transparency when the board makes decisions to fund something that have multi-year commitments. This happens when you have a revenue source, such as TID 25. For Holtzman, we had multiple TIDs that closed at a certain time. In this case, it's COVID now. So when you have a revenue source that's tied to something, we can use the assigned fund balance process to just track it more clearer. And the TID 25 process worked well for us. But I think this is just kind of a lesson learned coming out of that. And before we go to COVID, I think now is the time to act on that lesson learned.
Thanks, Kelly. Are there any questions at this point? Chris?
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm saying that it's going to increase the transparency. Can you tell us, like, give me an example of what it would look like coming back to us at that transparency? What does that transparency look like as far as a report, or how we would be able to see where that goes?
It'll be in the budget book. Very clearly laid out. In the budget book, there's an appendix document for the fund balance, and it has the fund balance in the past and then in the upcoming year projection for the year-end fund balance for the upcoming year. And so instead of it just being kind of one number, it'll be the unrestricted numbers, the restricted numbers. Restricted is the ones that are tied by law and it has to be restricted. And then now we'll have an assigned, and that assigned will be tied to the 3 or 4 projects. I don't really ever expect that it should be any more than that. That the board has committed certain funds to certain projects over the years. So it would sit right in that appendix. So it would be part of the budgeting process moving forward. And that's where you would see it in the draft budget books in April, the June budget votes in June, here on moving forward.
Okay, and are those labeled and itemized within the assigned to be able to see what the projects are over years?
The form itself that you vote on when you pass the budget, it's just assigned $1 amount. So anything that's in assigned is all summed together. But we'll have as part of the notes, what's the project and kind of what's the rollover dollar amount. So it's not what's required. So it's not in the actual table, but it'll be part of the notes of the table.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And just for example, the Holtzman discussion, when it crosses 3 boards, it gets really convoluted and it's hard for us to make decisions. So in the future, that should not happen. If a board commits funding to a project, it would exist in the budget book then. And there's just a public way of pointing back to what a board decision they made. And then it becomes more obvious in the budget process if you choose to unassign, to reverse something that a previous board kind of decided. There's like a moment in time to do that then too.
Okay, thanks.
Kelly, I would like a clarification just on which part of this change is the part that is required by law.
Just the one that assigns authority for the
Okay.
super kind of intendant designee. That's the piece in the policy that just needs to be clear, where it says like the multi-year carryover. It just needs to be
Okay.
clear that the policy approves this way of working. Accounting policy approves this way of working and even appreciates it. But our policy needs to support it. And so it's just making sure our policy is clear.
So one change in the policy that I wanted to just clarify for my own understanding of how the budget works is that the old version talks about assigning fund balances to encumbered funds or open encumbrances, and we're changing that to specific initiatives. And I don't actually understand what an open encumbrance is versus a specific initiative.
Yeah, that's specifically the part that GAP no longer allows.
Okay.
So
Got it.
that's the open encumbrance piece in particular is the piece that we had to make sure was updated.
That makes sense because I don't even understand how that works in our budget. So
We
thanks
don't,
for
we
that
don't actually do it anyways.
Okay.
Thank goodness.
And then I was just trying to wrap my head, this kind of builds off what Chris asked, but I was trying to wrap my head around how the added transparency and clarity in accounting, which I really appreciate, also works with board flexibility in the event of a crisis like COVID. So I came up with a hypothetical example. I was just kind of wondering if you could speak to how this might work in a budget. So my hypothetical example is, let's say last year we had an equity initiative to send students from Badger Rock Middle School on a really, fairly expensive field trip to go check out urban farms in another state. And COVID happened and that field trip had to get canceled. And we knew we couldn't do it next year because of all the uncertainty with COVID. So we wanted to take that money and reassign it to another use that makes more sense in this environment. How would we as a board in the budget process go about reassigning that money to a use that made more sense given the change in circumstances?
Yeah, so that example is a bit maybe not great for a couple reasons. One, for field trips, we don't budget in that way. Field trips would be under the Student Activity Fund, which has all of its own rules and accounting and has to balance on its own. So from the get-go, the field trip example is not a great example. But if I just ignore that for a minute and take it at its face, we would not use assigned fund balance for any one-off small thing here or there. And this should only be for large projects that are tied to a specific revenue source, which is why the TID is kind of likely to be. I mean, hopefully you don't have to deal with COVID, that this goes away at some point. But the TID examples are likely what's going to live in this. So another TID closes a couple years from now. You guys get $3 million coming to you off of one TID closure. You might just say, we want it all going into environmental projects at middle schools. That could theoretically happen in the next couple of years, right? Get a TID closure, $3 million, an environmental project. That would be the example of when we would use assigned fund balance, because it's a revenue source tied to a specific project that we need to link together and keep linked together until the project is done. We would not do this for one-off things here or there for a classroom, a project, a department. We have a budgeting process for a reason that manages all that. And those kind of examples are managed by the principal under their authority or a department leader under their authority. So the kind of example you give is not even under the board like authority.
Okay, so to broaden my question, because my example was clearly not good, if there was some long-term project that was in an assigned fund balance and for some reason we as a board felt like we needed to shift it to a bigger priority, do we do that through the budget amendment process or how would we do that?
Yeah, so if it's within, I don't know, like a supply line to a supply line, but just a different project, the board wouldn't even need to vote. That would be within my typical authority of doing what I do in my daily job, that we would, if there's something that is new and sudden and you need to fund, I don't know, COVID happens and you need money to fund something, the board technically wouldn't even need to vote. You could vote, you always can vote, in particular to direct me to do something, but that's something that if an emergency came up, I don't know, hailstorm and we needed it, instead of funding whatever project you told Chad to fund for environmental and you decided you needed it for a hailstorm, we could do that. It doesn't even take a budget amendment.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Are there any other questions about this revision? Kelly, what's the latest date that people could get to you individually with questions or changes?
On this particular policy, middle of next week would be just fine. I don't need a ton of turnaround time. Well, if you have major concerns and don't want me building it into the budget process as a way of working, I need to know that in the next 24 to 48 hours. Based on the comments I'm receiving tonight, I am assuming I can go ahead and building that into the budget book. If you have clarifying questions, examples like Chris was just kind of bouncing off me, feel free to send them well into the middle of next week.
All right, thank you, everybody. Go back to my board docs page here. We're done, unless anybody has any final questions or comments. I will move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor, raise your hands and say aye.
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 Motion carries. Thank you, everybody. This was a long meeting, but it was extremely productive, and I really appreciate all the great comments and feedback. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody. Thanks, Kelly.